Hi all, welcome back. Last time out, we discussed two main types of bones. The flat bones, making up things like your cranium, clavicle, ribs, those kind of things. And the long bones, making up things like your humerus, radius ulna, fibula, tibula, etc. Um, and we discussed kind of what the difference was between those. Now we're going to kind of discuss the different types of bone cells. And so the cells themselves is what laying down, in some cases, laying down the calcium phosphate material, which is going to become bone. Um, all right, so four main types of bone cells, and in many cases, they might, in some, I should say, in some cases they're complementary to each other. In other cases, they're the opposite of each other. Okay, so the first one that we're going to talk about is osteogenic cells. Okay, whenever you see ogenic in a biological term, or sometimes just genic in a biological term, it typically means that it's new, or it's what's producing new material, new cells. Okay, and in this case, genic often refers to stem, so stem cells, undifferentiated cells. Okay, so osteogenic cells are stem cells. They haven't differentiated into what type of bone cell they're going to be, but the osteo part means that they're going to be a bone cell. They occur in the bone region. They're going to differentiate into a bone cell. Now, often they're going to differentiate into an osteoblast, okay? But in young individuals, they could generate into osteoclasts. Not that older individuals don't have osteoclasts. They do. They just have far less of it. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, they arise from mesenchyme cells, which is another type of stem cell. It's an embryonic stem cell, and given the region, will become an osteogenic cell. Then the osteogenic cell will become a differentiated cell, some type of osteo or bone cell, either a blast or a clast or site. Okay. Osteoblasts, we've already talked about them a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate, they form new bone. They form bone material. Okay. They perform what we call osteogenesis, or they're generating some type of material. And in this case, they're laying down collagen fibers. Okay? And those collagen fibers will have seed crystals on them. And these seed crystals will become mineralized, and they'll go through calcification or mineralization, and they will start building and enlarging. Okay? And that's really what's going to lay down and make up bone. Okay? Osteocytes, on the other hand, okay, are former osteoblasts. Okay? They occur in regions where the material has been laid down and they are encased within that material. Okay, so they still have the capability of generating new material, okay, but they don't have the ability to move in, say, the bloodstream. They don't have any ability because they are now encapsulated. They're trapped. Okay? And so they will reside in little teeny cavities, which we call lacunae. Okay? And then there are channels that connect different lacunae called canalucei. And that canalucei is really what's allowing for the osteocytes to send signals between each other. Sometimes nutrients, but a lot of times signaling molecules be sent to indicate maybe there's a need for more bone growth in this region, maybe there's a need for less bone growth, that kind of stuff that can occur. Okay? And we'll come back and we'll talk about what might trigger that, what hormones might trigger whether or not you're going to lay down bone or dissolve bone. The purpose of the osteoclast is to dissolve bone. Okay? So they have digestive enzymes, lots of lysosomes inside these cells, and they're going to deposit digestive enzymes, which is going to deteriorate the collagen and the calcium phosphate molecules. It's going to break it down, and then that material can then be used to rebuild bone material or used in other processes. Phosphate is used in lots of different things. Calcium's used in other things also. Okay, and that process is called osteolysis. So lyse means to break up. And so if we say we lyse the cells, means that we break their membranes. And so in this case, osteolysis, or to break bone. Okay, so two kind of ways at which these different bone cells can be formed. So you can have an osteogenic cell, again, because of where it occurs, it's already been predetermined to be bone related. Okay, it's still stem cell, it's still juvenile, but it's bone related, and it can develop into an osteoblast. And these osteoblasts are like cells that we talked about before. They're going to have a nucleus and endoplasmic reticulum and places for ribosomes to sit on the rough ER and Golgi apparatuses, and they can secrete vesicles because they're going to be making proteins and whatnot, and they can excrete that material out. And so here's what one would look like, an osteocyte, after it's been encapsulated or kind of bound into a general region. It will release dendrites. These dendrites are going to be that calcium phosphate material that's hardened, and then there's going to be a cell body. It's still alive, but just generating material that kind of keeps it encapsulated in one place. The osteoclasts, on the other hand, their job is to kind of travel to regions and deteriorate these osteocytes, to remove the osteocytes. Okay? So they come from stem cells. They differentiate into an osteoclast. They're going to release a bunch of digestive enzymes. So you'll see lots of lysosomes inside these cells. They release it, and those enzymes will start deteriorating the bone that needs to be removed. Okay? We'll talk about when that might be the case. All right, so if we're talking about osteosis or bone tissue matrix, let's talk about what kind of it is made of. What is this bone material made of? Okay, so first of all, 1/3 is organic. 1/3 is then what we would call carbon-based molecules, and it's made by the organism, and so that's what we call an organic molecule. Okay, and then there's 2/3 inorganic. The 2/3 inorganic would come from things that are element-based minerals and things like that you could get from kind of diet, or in some cases maybe from the reaction of UV or something along those lines. Okay, so the organic matter, that's going to be synthesized by osteoblasts. Okay? And that's where the collagen and the carbohydrate complex comes in. So collagen fibers are going to be laid down, and a carbohydrate protein complex is going to be associated with it. Carbohydrates, remember, are sugars, and then proteins. And so these can be made, and they're organic. Plants make carbohydrates, animals use the energy from that carbohydrate to make proteins, and you can stick them together to kind of make this complex. Other things can be associated, and they can have different types of carbohydrate proteins. You can have carbohydrates and the building blocks to proteins, so which we call glycoaminoglycans. Okay, so the amino group, not a true protein, will be associated with some carbohydrates. You can have proteoglycans, you can have glycoproteins. There's lots of ways in which this can be structured, but all of this is organic. The inorganic matter, on the other hand, is coming from minerals. Right? And so the biggest portion of that, the by far the most, probably the most important piece of this, is what we call hydroxyapatite. Okay? Hydroxyapatite is a crystallized calcium phosphate salt. Okay, and so that is a combination of calcium and phosphate that can form a crystal. Okay? And the important piece with that is that crystal can bind to these collagen fibers. And when it does, it then can attract more calcium, okay? Either in the form of calcium carbonate or other calcium phosphate salts. Okay? It also can attract other inorganic ions, zinc, magnesium, other things that we have in our bone. Okay? And so by far, hydroxyapatite is the real important inorganic matter. Not to take anything away from calcium carbonate, also very important. Calcium carbonate is a material that we see in lots of other organisms. Calcium carbonate is what makes up shells of things like a clam or even a snail. Calcium carbonate is typically what's making that up, but that's about 10% of our bone. Okay. The combination of the two, having this organic material and then this hard mineralized material, is what provides flexibility around the bone matrix. Okay. And we'll come back and talk about that flexibility. Okay. So collagen and minerals, again, provides flexibility and strength. Okay. Now, the mineral portion is important because it's providing a rigid structure. Okay? And that rigid structure allows support for weight over time. Okay? And when we see disorders or diseases that are associated with maybe bones that are really flexible, bones that might bend but not break, it's normally associated with a lack of minerals. Okay, so like Ricketts disease, and we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more, is a mineral deficiency. And so the bones become soft, and then when weight's put on them, they tend to bend. And so instead of being long, straight bones, they tend to be kind of bowed bones. And this can happen in adults also if there's a lack of minerals. The protein portion, again, that's really the flexibility. These are organic molecules. Okay, they're not rigid molecules. They have the ability to kind of bend but not break, and that's really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, juvenile bones has a lot of collagen molecules, a lot more protein kind of in the mix. And so you have to have a lot more flexibility. And this is why we always say, well, children are flexible. Children, they can fall and not break a bone, but if you fell from that high, your bone would shatter. Okay. And that's because a lot of their bone is more collagen. Okay. It's more flexible. And these fibers can break under stress, but they can be repaired fairly quickly. Okay. More so than the actual mineral portion of the bone. Okay? And as time goes by, that collagen part of the bone actually gets solidified and becomes mineral. And we kind of already talked about that epiphyseal plate versus the epiphyseal line. Okay? Osteogenesis imperfecta is a bone disorder, which we call the brittle bone disease. Okay, and that's really where the collagen molecules are missing. The collagen is not deposited, and so really you just have a high amount of mineral, and it causes the bones to be brittle and kind of shatter when there's stress that's put on them. Okay, so the flexibility is gone at that point. All right, that we can look at the histology of compact bone. We already talked about this a little bit when we talked about connective tissue, but just to kind of go through it, because in some cases it's fairly important to know this and how bones heal. Okay, so first you have these concentric lamellae. Okay, these are circles, these are rings. Okay, that these rings form around a central canal. The central canal is a place where blood vessels and nerves will run through it, and I'll show you a cross section of bone here shortly. Okay, and that's where blood vessels and nerves will run. But then you have these concentric lamellae that run around it. Okay, and together the concentric lamellae and the canal makes up an osteotome. Okay, and so we often call that region, that circular region, the osteotome. Okay, and you can have some connection between canals, between osteotomes, across from each other, and then you can have some building around the outer edge. But important to the construction of an osteotome is when these lamellae are laid down. Okay, they're collagen-based material is laid down in the opposite direction. So maybe the inside lamellae, let's say the collagen is moving in a counterclockwise motion. Then the next ring, it would be clockwise. Okay? And then the next ring, it's counterclockwise. And so they alternate the direction at which the collagen is being laid down. The importance to this is you can get minute micro fractures that occur, but they won't move. Often they won't move from one lamellae to the next, but they won't move across osteotomes. Okay, so they'll be isolated in one osteotome, then it can be fixed and repaired, and it won't move across to all of them. And to help with that is there's also on the outside of osteotomes, there's what we call a cement line. Okay, and that's a harder kind of structure that prevents those microfractures from happening or from spreading. Okay, and then across the whole outside is a circumventral lamellae. Okay, that encircles the entire region, and interstitial lamellae are going to fill kind of the gaps between the osteotomes. Okay, so let's look at some examples of kind of this as we go. So again, compact bone outside, you can see there. I mean, if you were looking at this under the microscope, you'd be able to see some foramen, some little teeny holes in it, but not like the spongy bone. The spongy bone has a lot of open space, space for blood vessels to run, space for blood to be generated, etc. And associated with that blood is often going to be fat. Okay, because you need this adipose tissue to supply the energy. Okay, so again, adipose fat cells are just energy storage, and any place where you have a lot of material being generated, a lot of new cells being generated, you should have adipose tissue associated with that. Okay, bone marrow in between the tuberculae, just to kind of provide that region where bone marrow, new red blood cells and white blood cells can be generated, okay, and it's associated with fat. Okay. So here's looking at those ossetones. Remember, ossitone is kind of this entire circle. So that entire circle right there, each one of those rings, this is like if you looked at like a tree, a cross section of a tree, you would see tree rings. Same thing, kind of bone rings. Each one of those bone rings is called the lamellae. Okay? And this would be, you can kind of see it. You can see these little cells, okay? These little nucleated osteocyte cells, okay? They're what's generating this, okay? They're what's kicking off this collagen fibers, okay? And counter and clockwise arrangements and allowing for hydroxyapatite to come in and lay crystals down on this to make it hard, etc. And then you have that central canal where you can see those blood vessels and nerves shooting through. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little more about spongy bone. So spongy bone anatomy, it's going to have both tuberculae, okay, so these plates, and then it's going to have slivers, which we call spiracles. There's lots of things in science called spiracles, but these spiracles are these little bone slivers and that kind of project out. And the tuberculae is kind of that scaffolding that allows for these open spaces, these spaces at which can be filled with bone marrow. Okay, now in general, there's not very many ossetones in spongy bone. They occur kind of in more spread out regions. It's not compact bone. You don't have a lot really tightly connected. Okay, and there's no need for a central canal because there's enough lamellae, there's enough open space for the blood vessels and the nerves to run. In the spongy bone, and you don't need these central canals at which where that material might run. A couple things. Spongy bone is, advantageous in the sense that it still provides strength against certain types of stress, okay? But it's super light compared to compact bone. And so even though it's not as strong as compact bone, there's still a lot of strength to it, but less weight, which makes it advantageous because the more weight you might have, of course, the more muscle attachment, the greater the muscle would have to be, the more energy you would have to expend to move that body. So the lighter you can get those bones, the better you will be at conserving and utilizing energy in a better way. We can come back and talk about that energy expenditure later. Okay, so the last thing I just want to talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is Wolff's Law. So Wolff's Law states that any place where you might have stress, okay, typically from weight or muscle pulling on that material, okay, you have what we call a line of stress, and those lines of stress are going to be where you have a transition from spongy bone to compact bone. So that spongy bone would be converted into compact bone along those lines of stress. And so once you get these lines of stress and you get a lot of pressure building up in that region, okay, spongy bone will give away to compact bone. So that spongy bone will start to be filled in with more hydroxyapatite, more calcium carbonate, and it'll just build a much stronger structure with less lamellae, less open space in between. Okay, next time we'll talk about some injuries and other things associated with bones.